Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Attorney General Bondi, right here. We are joined in this room by some of the thousands of survivors from Jeffrey Epstein's horrific sex trafficking ring. They have shown such incredible courage in speaking out, in demanding accountability to bring the predators and pedophiles to justice. The Epstein Files Transparency Act required your Department of Justice to disclose the perpetrators connected with Epstein's criminal activities and to redact the information of survivors to protect their identities. Let me show you what actually happened. First, in violation of the law, your department has shown a pattern of redacting the names of powerful predators. Here behind me is one example of an email from Epstein to a man whose name was redacted. The email reads, quote, "Where are you? Are you okay? I loved the torture video." Only after members of Congress demanded that we see the unredacted files did the world learn the name of this individual, Sultan Ahmed bin Sulayem, the chairman and CEO of a company that had financial ties to President Trump's business and personal ties to Trump's advisor, Steve Bannon. Second, the survivors were not similarly protected, also in violation of the law. Here is another email titled Epstein Victim List. We have blurred the names of the survivors for their protection, but your Department of Justice initially released this list of 32 survivors' names with only one name redacted, along with numerous files that disclose not only the names, the emails, and the addresses of survivors, but also nude photographs and even the identities of Jane Does who had been protected for decades until your department released their names. Survivors are now telling us that their families are finding out for the first time that they were trafficked by Epstein. In their words, quote, "This release does not provide closure. It feels like a deliberate attempt to intimidate survivors, punish those who came forward, and reinforce the same culture of secrecy that allowed Epstein's crimes to continue for decades." To the survivors in the room, and if you are willing, please raise your hands if you have still not been able to meet with this Department of Justice. Please know for the record that every single survivor has raised their hand. Attorney General Bondi, you apologized to the survivors in your opening statement for what they went through at the hands of Jeffrey Epstein. Will you turn to them now and apologize for what your Department of Justice has put them through with the absolutely unacceptable release of the Epstein files and their information?
Congresswoman, you sat before, Merrick Garland sat in this chair twice.
Attorney General Bondi,
No, can I finish my answer?
No, I'm going to reclaim my time because I asked you a specific question that I would like you to answer, which is, will you turn to the survivors? This is not about anybody that came before you. It is about you taking responsibility for your Department of Justice and the harm that it has done to the survivors who are standing right behind you and are waiting for you to turn to them and apologize for what your Department of Justice has done.
Members get to ask the questions, the witness gets to answer in the way they want to answer them.
To two documents I'm hoping we will put up on the screen. In the first, an individual emails Jeffrey Epstein asking whether a woman identified as M was pro or civilian, and Epstein responds that she was a civilian, Russian, and fun. In the second email, Epstein writes to Steve Tisch about a Ukrainian girl, noting that she was, quote, a little freaked out by the age difference and stating that he would try to convince her not to return to Ukraine. He then instructs Mr. Tisch to call him, adding, "I don't like records of these conversations." So I'd like to ask straightforward question that really is either a yes or no answer. Do these emails constitute credible evidence, not proof, but credible evidence warning further investigation into whether Steve Tisch was involved in Epstein's criminal conduct? Do you think yes or no?
I'm not going to play a yes-no game with you, but I will answer the question to the best of my ability. As I said, we will look and investigate any case involving any victim. I'm not familiar, there were 3 million pages, of course, with that email, but of course.
Of times Trump's name appears in the files, so it could at least be 1,000 times. Is that right?
The number is a total misleading factor. We have not released anyone's name in the Epstein files that has not been credible.
Director, could it at
least be 1,000 times? We have released every piece of legally permissible information.
Okay,
you can characterize the numbers however you want it.
Claiming my time, Director. It sounds like if you don't know the number, it could at least be 1,000 times. Which
it's not. It's not.
Is it at least 500 times?
No.
Is it at least 100 times?
No.
Then what's the number?
I don't know the number.
What you've just witnessed is a congressional hearing that has reignited one of the most disturbing chapters in modern American history, the Jeffrey Epstein sex trafficking scandal. But this hearing wasn't primarily about Epstein himself. It was about what happened after his death, and specifically how the United States Department of Justice handled the release of millions of pages of documents related to his crimes. The Epstein Files Transparency Act was supposed to bring clarity and justice. Passed with overwhelming bipartisan support, all but one member of the House voted for it, and signed into law by President Trump, the legislation had a clear mandate: release documents that identify perpetrators and potential co-conspirators in Epstein's sex trafficking ring while protecting the identities of survivors. The goal was simple accountability without re-victimization. But according to multiple members of Congress who testified during this hearing, the Department of Justice did precisely the opposite. They protected the powerful and exposed the vulnerable. Let's examine what actually happened. When the DOJ released these files, they implemented a pattern of redactions that raised serious questions. Names of individuals with apparent connections to Epstein's activities were blacked out, even when emails contained deeply disturbing content. The example shown during the hearing is particularly chilling. An email from Epstein to an unnamed individual that read, "Where are you? Are you okay? I loved the torture video." The recipient's name was redacted by the Department of Justice. Only after sustained pressure from members of Congress was that name revealed: Sultan Ahmed bin Sulam, who served as chairman and CEO of a company with financial connections to President Trump's businesses and maintained personal ties to Steve Bannon, who served as a key advisor in the Trump administration. The question raised by Congress members was straightforward. If this individual's name appeared in such a context, why was it protected while survivors' identities were not? The contrast becomes even more stark when we examine how survivors were treated. The Department of Justice released a document titled Epstein Victim List, containing the names of 32 survivors with only one name redacted. This directly contradicts the Epstein Files Transparency Act, which explicitly required that survivor identities be protected. But the release went far beyond just names. Survivors had their email addresses and physical addresses disclosed. Nude photographs that Epstein had taken were included in the release. Perhaps most damaging of all, the identities of Jane Does, women who had been granted anonymity and legal protection for decades, were suddenly made public. The human impact of these failures cannot be overstated. Survivors reported that family members were learning for the first time about their victimization through these public releases. Imagine surviving one of the most traumatic experiences possible, spending years or even decades working through that trauma, perhaps choosing not to burden your family with those painful details, only to have the federal government publish your story, your name, and your photographs for the world to see. The survivors issued a joint statement that was read during the hearing, and their words deserve to be heard in full context. They said the release does not provide closure. It feels like a deliberate attempt to intimidate survivors, punish those who came forward, and reinforce the same culture of secrecy that allowed Epstein's crimes to continue for decades. This wasn't just bureaucratic incompetence they were describing. It was a systemic betrayal that echoed the very dynamics that enabled Epstein's abuse in the first place. Powerful people protected, vulnerable people exposed. During the hearing, every single survivor present, and there were many in that room, raised their hand when asked if they had been unable to meet with the Department of Justice about these violations. Not some of them, not most of them, every single one. This represents a complete breakdown in the government's responsibility to the very people it claimed to be seeking justice for. Attorney General Pam Bondi was then asked a direct question. Would she turn to the survivors in the room and apologize for what the Department of Justice had put them through? Her response was to deflect, mentioning her predecessor, Merrick Garland. The Congresswoman interrupted, reclaiming her time, and made clear this wasn't about previous administrations, it was about current accountability. The Attorney General never turned to face the survivors. She never issued the apology requested. But the hearing went beyond questions of privacy violations. Congress members presented evidence suggesting that the Department of Justice may have closed investigations prematurely or failed to pursue potential co-conspirators. Specific emails were highlighted that appear to show patterns consistent with sex trafficking operations. In one email chain, an individual asks Epstein whether a woman identified only as M was pro or civilian, terminology that appears to distinguish between professional sex workers and non-professionals. Epstein responds that she was a civilian, Russian, and fun. In another email, Epstein wrote to someone named Steve Tisch about a Ukrainian girl, noting she was a little freaked out by the age difference and stating he would try to convince her not to return to Ukraine. Epstein then instructed Tisch to call him rather than continue the email exchange, explicitly stating, "I don't like records of these conversations." To anyone familiar with sex trafficking indicators, these emails contain multiple red flags. The focus on nationality and controlling where young women could travel, the acknowledgement of age differences causing discomfort, the deliberate avoidance of creating written records, the apparent involvement of other individuals in these communications. These are textbook elements of trafficking and exploitation. When the Attorney General was asked directly whether these emails constituted credible evidence warranting further investigation into Steve Tisch's potential involvement in Epstein's criminal conduct, she refused to give a yes or no answer. She stated that the department would look into anything, but acknowledged she wasn't familiar with that specific email among the 3 million pages released. She emphasized that redacted versions of documents were left open for members of Congress to review, though, as one representative pointed out, with only 4 computers available for 435 House members, meaningful review would take many months. The hearing also touched on broader questions about the scope of Epstein's operation. FBI Director Kash Patel had previously testified before this committee that there was no credible information indicating that Epstein trafficked victims to anyone else. Yet the documents themselves appear to contradict this assertion. Multiple emails show Epstein discussing women with other individuals, making arrangements, and involving others in what appear to be trafficking activities. A U.S. attorney's information from the Southern District of New York, viewed by one of the representatives, apparently indicated additional survivors and probable co-conspirators beyond those publicly acknowledged. This raises a fundamental question. How could the Department of Justice conduct what it called an exhaustive review of the Epstein files in July and conclude that no additional individuals would be charged when the documents themselves contain apparent evidence of other people's involvement? A particularly contentious exchange occurred regarding how many times President Trump's name appeared in the released files. Director Patel initially couldn't or wouldn't provide a specific number. When pressed with questions about whether it was at least 1,000 times, 500 times, or 100 times, he answered no to each, but still couldn't state the actual figure. Attorney General Bondi later acknowledged the number was substantial, effectively contradicting Patel's testimony. This lack of transparency about basic factual questions undermined confidence in the department's handling of the entire release. The hearing concluded with testimony about what some members characterized as the weaponization of the Justice Department. Representatives described their own experiences having phone records seized, being targeted for investigations, and facing ethics complaints in apparent retaliation for their oversight work. One representative detailed how in 2017 and 2018, she and Congressman Adam Schiff had their phone and email records seized by the Justice Department under President Trump, in what an Inspector General report later found to be improper retaliation for their roles in investigating Russian interference. Another described how, after participating in President Trump's first impeachment proceedings, an FBI agent leaked information about her cooperation in an unrelated national security case, leading to death threats despite FBI leadership's public statements that she was never suspected of wrongdoing. These accounts were presented not to excuse any failures in the current administration, but to illustrate a pattern that regardless of which party controls the executive branch, The Justice Department has repeatedly been used as a tool for political purposes rather than pursuing justice impartially. What makes the Epstein files controversy particularly egregious is that the law was clear, the vote was bipartisan, and the victims had already suffered immeasurably. This should have been straightforward. Protect survivors, expose perpetrators, pursue justice. Instead, the opposite occurred, leaving survivors feeling victimized once again, this time by the very institution that was supposed to deliver them justice. The question now is what happens next. Will there be accountability for the officials who decided to release survivor information while redacting alleged perpetrators' names? Will the investigations that appear to have been prematurely closed be reopened? Will the survivors finally receive the apology and respect they deserve? And perhaps most importantly, will the American people ever get the full truth about the scope of Jeffrey Epstein's operation and who else was involved? As this hearing demonstrated, those answers remain frustratingly out of reach. What is clear is that justice delayed is justice denied. And for Epstein's survivors, justice has been denied far too many times. The courage they showed by standing in that hearing room, by raising their hands, by continuing to demand accountability despite being failed repeatedly by those in power, that courage deserves more than deflection and excuses. It deserves action, transparency, and finally, real justice.